when you can set that aside for a moment and embrace another's perspective, who you might be negotiating with or working with, etc., that is kind of a superpower, actually. It actually gives you an informational advantage because now you are understanding how they're thinking.
Welcome to a winning mental health movement, a space where we turn conversations into action for mental health. I'm Karis Myrick, the Senior Vice President of Partnerships and Innovation at Inseparable, and I'm thrilled to be here to guide you through this series with my fellow co-hosts. Inseparable is a national organization driving transformative policy change to build a mental health system one win at a time that works for everyone, because no one should have to struggle alone.
I'm Kathleen Doughty, and I serve as the SVP of Campaigns and Communications at Inseparable. Inseparable's work is all about hope, action, and impact, and that's exactly what this podcast embodies. In this series, we'll learn from experts on the front lines of mental health advocacy, break down life-saving policy wins, plan for the work ahead, and hopefully inspire you to join the movement.
Because we can't do this without you. I'm Allie Larson, Director of Policymaker and Candidate Relations here at Inseparable. And as part of our WIN workshop, we've been training with advocates across the country to build a grassroots movement for mental health care. This podcast series was adapted from the live virtual sessions we conducted with our inaugural cohort to help distribute critical information to the people fighting for better mental health policy. Whether you're a policymaker, a caregiver, or someone who's struggled to get help, this is your invitation to join us as we learn how to not just fight, but win mental health campaigns, because winning saves lives.
Welcome back to Inseparable WIN Workshop. So excited that you're here with us today. So today we're going to hear from two experts on policymaker engagement, which are Shayne Woods and Jason Wentworth. And they're going to help us understand how lawmakers and lobbyists work, the relationship between the two, and how to effectively use one or both for your organizations. Now, they're also going to give us some practical tips for engaging policymakers to support the mental health movement. So I am now going to turn this over to Kathleen, who will do a little bit more introduction of the topic and introduce our speakers. And so Kathleen, you want to take it from here?
Sure. Thanks, Karis. So today we have Shayne Woods, who's a vice president of Alpine Group, which lobbies at the federal level, and Jason Wentworth, who's the former Michigan Speaker of the House and now lobbies in Michigan. And Inseparable is lucky to work with dozens of lobbyists across the country, and we work with a lot of really amazing people, but these two stand out as really exceptional examples. So we're just thrilled to have them here today. And I'm going to shift gears and have them introduce themselves. So thank you both for being here. One of the things we love to do on the WIN workshop is understand the career path that led people to their current roles. So we'd love to hear your stories, where you're from, and what path led you to your current lobbying career.
Sure. Well, thanks, Kathleen. I appreciate you guys having me. It's always been wonderful working with Inseparable. And so my career path to where I'm at now is kind of a unique one when you talk about engaging in politics. So I was actually working for the Michigan Veterans Affairs Agency for a while prior to being elected. And that agency was a state-run agency helping veterans and their families connect with benefits across the state of Michigan. And as I was in that work, I realized that there was a huge disconnect between the federal government, state government, local governments, and how veterans actually receive care and their benefits that they've earned. And so I just looked up my state representative from my area, literally on Google, and called them, said, hey, can we meet up at the Doherty Hotel in Clare? I got some ideas on how you can fix some of the gaps in coverage that we have for veterans and their families in our region. Sure. To my surprise, about 4 or 5 days later, I'm at the Doherty Hotel sitting across from Joel Johnson, the state rep. And I said, here's a package of ideas that we need to advocate for and get across the finish line to help Michigan veterans and their families. And he said, well, I love the idea, but I'm term limited out. I don't have a lot of time left in the legislature. And I'm not going to have the time to commit to this. This is an election year. And I recommend you find one of the candidates, help them get elected, and then bring this to them next year. And so I went home and researched the candidates. And that night, and I had no desire to get involved in politics, zero, none whatsoever. About 4 a.m. in the morning, I elbowed my wife. I said, "Hey, wake up." She's like, what's going on? I said, "I'm going to run for state rep." And she's like, "You're crazy. Going back to bed. What are you even thinking about? You love your job." I said, "I know, but I don't like any of those candidates that announced. I think they're all good people. I just know that I could do a better job at getting this done if I were to get elected." And the 2 or 3 days later, I drove to Lansing with my affidavit and $100 check, turned it in, and came home and said, "I'm going to be on the ballot." And from then it was just door to door campaigning to get elected. Once I got elected, I was the chair of Military and Veterans Affairs my first term. And so I was really able to advocate from that position now, instead of being just a constituent who had a lot of awareness and knowledge of the problems. Now I could actually legislate and fix those problems. And so that's how I became a legislator.
Well, wow, Jason. I don't know how you even follow something like that. That was an incredible story, and it's a pleasure to connect with you. And thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you, Inseparable, for having me here today. As Kathleen mentioned, Shayne Woods, Vice President, handling healthcare matters with the Alpine Group in Washington, D.C. So my background, like Jason, never thought that I would find myself in politics, which seems kind of to be like the modus operandi of like most folks in politics. Generally they find themselves in purely by accident. I'm just an average kid, from a small town with a funny name in Tennessee. A lot of horse farms, actually, where I'm from. So country boy at heart. Enjoy getting back to see my family back in Tennessee every now and again. So mine was actually an entrepreneurial journey to this town, and it really has started with me graduating college. When the economy had a downturn, there were no companies really hiring at the time, and so after just continuing to knock on doors and send my resume in and not hearing back, I just decided, what, I'm going to similar to Jason, going to his state capital city. I went to mine in Nashville, but it was via the interweb, and just filed my application for starting a business. Knew nothing about actually starting a business outside of a lawn care company that I started when I was 12 years old, so I could buy a super soaker water gun for the summer. But nonetheless, that's the that was the entrepreneurial spirit that I had, and I guess I just didn't know any better, didn't have better options, but started a company straight out of college. It was a healthcare consultancy, just really born out of experience that I had gained as a intern in Washington, D.C. as the Affordable Care Act was going through Congress, and so went around and managed to rustle up some clients, help them with implementation of the Affordable Care Act. So worked a lot with managed care organizations for a few years as they waded their way through various regulations at the state and local level set forward by the federal government. During that time, I got very interested in what was happening. Things like pedometer programs, workplace wellness programs were sprouting up all over the place. Fitbit, Nike Plus, Jawbone, all of those wearable devices were very, very hot. Everybody was into those, and so I became very, very interested in a lot of the data that was being spun out from a lot of these devices. But ultimately, was being locked away in data banks in California and other places, and it had a lot of predictive value. A lot of health providers could do something with it, but they were locked out of these devices, and so two other techies from my hometown, and we created a information technology startup that really pulled together and all of these different devices and health data from all these disparate data streams, and brought them all together in one place so people could get a holistic picture of their healthcare story. We then made it possible for people to then share that healthcare data package with various providers, and then those providers could provide feedback on what they were seeing and in helping people better reach and obtain their healthcare goals. During that time, ran into a lot of regulatory barriers, and that inspired me to go to Washington, D.C. First to visit with my lawmakers, telling them about our company and what we were trying to do, and a lot of it I saw kind of eyes glazing over, especially at a staff level, and at some certain point, I decided, what, I think this is where I need to be. I think I could really do some good here, and can be helpful to members and other folks in Congress with understanding healthcare data. And so that's what I did. I left my company, packed up my Jeep, moved out to Washington, D.C. without a job, interviewed, started as an intern. The internship, then turned into a full-time position in Washington, and kind of worked my way up the ladder to be able to affect change as a healthcare staffer, first on the House side, and then later on the Senate side, and then after that, found my way to the Alpine Group with incredible organizations like Inseparable.
Thank you, Shayne. I love this life story section. Like, I feel like I've been working with both of you for years, but know you both so much better now. So thank you for walking us through that. Pivoting a little bit to the fundamentals of lobbying, I'd love to sort of hear how you set clients up for success with when they sort of engage in a contract and they have goals with you. So Jason, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, I think the number one thing that I try to tell clients is you have to set realistic goals, define what those are, and be as specific as you can. And so, obviously we want to know the legislative process and the key players and the timing of all of the issues that you're bringing to the table as a client. But also, we want to be able to avoid overpromising, right? So we want to make sure we set the expectation very clear and early that nothing in my capital Lansing happens quickly. Policy change takes time. You have to be persistent, and provide reliable data to the legislators and to the process. It's not just enough to come with a solution. You have to come with constituency and data and information that is relevant to those lawmakers. And so I try to set that up early. But I think the biggest one is just set the expectation that things do not happen quickly. We have divided government, and I think that's a good thing. I don't think any one party should rule all three, the governor's office, the Senate, and the House. But that also makes things more difficult when it is divided. And so just be persistent.
And that is, very, very sound advice. And the only thing I would add there is, identifying the right champion. So, there are a lot of, committees of jurisdiction or folks on those committees of jurisdiction that you could go to. But ultimately, as Jason mentioned, change takes time. And, with time, you can have folks become disengaged in the process. Or, I don't want to use the word distracted because that maybe has a negative connotation. But, invariably, there are other things that are going to pop up on the radar screen. There's going to be competing priorities that invariably happen, some that you can anticipate. Because, it happens with a regular cadence, right? Things need to be reauthorized, et cetera. But then, things that you cannot necessarily anticipate, natural disasters, world events, things like that, that pop up that you never saw really coming. So, that can pull away, that mental bandwidth, of the folks that you're speaking with. And so when you have identified the right champion, someone who is deeply passionate about the things that you care about, whether that's at a broad level like mental health, or whether at that more granular level, a particular fix, identifying that right champion, that engaged, that passionate champion, is certainly key. But a lot of that, really comes with time as well. And you've got to build genuine relationships with people. There's no shortcut for that. And so, another thing I would mention as well, that's kind of a little secret that I picked up as a staffer on whenever I was negotiating with colleagues, maybe in another office, or even within my own office. Maybe it was a supervisor, or or a boss, or whatever it might be. There's that perception. You could probably have heard of that, about this perception versus perspective, right? Perception being what I interpret, how I interpret the world around me, versus that perspective, which is a point of view. And so many folks, and it's not a criticism, but folks are stuck in their perception. And so when you can set that aside for a moment and embrace another's perspective, who you might be negotiating with or working with, etc., that is kind of a superpower. Actually, it actually gives you an informational advantage, because now you are understanding how they're thinking. And meanwhile, again, that person that you are working with, or might be working on, is still stuck in their own perception. So just a kind of few things that I've picked up along the way that have been helpful for clients.
That's great advice. I like the notion of an informational advantage. I think that's like a good under discussed asset in this process. So Shayne touched on this and set us up well for the next question. Champions, we talk about all the time, both at the federal level and at the states. Building relationships, ideally before you need them, is critical to this work. Can you guys talk a little bit about how you do that, how you sort of coach clients and set clients up to pick the right people and to cultivate those relationships?
Yeah, I think Shayne touched on it a little bit, and I love that analogy. And the way that you pick a champion, sometimes you have to go with the heart, right? You have to go with someone that is going to just be a champion through and through, and they're going to run through a brick wall, and they're going to do whatever it takes to get this issue done. And sometimes you go with the stats, right? You study the lawmaker, you study their background and their maybe their leadership role or committee chair. Maybe that's the route you take. But it's really critical that before you get too far in the process, you have to pick who those people might be, and identify them, and then start building that relationship before you need them, right? That's I think that's the number one problem with a lot of legislation when it stalls. It's the sponsor is just not the right person for the legislation, and unfortunately, many times there isn't the pre-work done to identify that, and so that takes time. Like, I've even looked at previous committee hearings, just watched them on speed 2, right? And just let them, who's looking at their phone, who's engaging with the speakers, is the topic of interest to them. And, I'll have a meeting with the legislator, and they'll go, yeah. Or even the staff. Yeah, my boss loves this issue. Yep, he's working on it. It's something he's going to work on in his community, and loves it, right? Well, great. That sounds like a home run. The client's excited. Hey, could they be our sponsor? And I go back and I look at issues that they were, in their committees, and they're not engaged at all. Sometimes not even present in the committee hearing. So it's like, are they really interested in that issue, or are they telling you what you want to hear because you're in front of them? And so it's really a lot about, picking the right person, study the stats, but sometimes you got to go with the heart. It's just a decision that the client has to make with as much information as we can give as possible. But I think it's one of the biggest ways for us, to succeed, is pick the right sponsor.
Yeah, and just building off of what Jason mentioned, with regard to obviously those committees of jurisdiction, right, and those members who are on those committees of jurisdiction, again, those things are certainly important, but as Jason, alluded to there, who are the movers and of those particular issues on those committees of jurisdiction, right? Not maybe they might not be the mover and shaker of that committee, right? They might not be the ranking member, they might not be the chair, of the, full committee or the subcommittee that, has jurisdiction over your issue. But they might be that passionate person when it comes to that particular issue. When it comes to mental health, they might be the thought leader on that, where other members of the committee really look to that particular individual or group of individuals on the committee. They almost become like the tastemakers, if you will, of those particular issues on the committee. In Washington, often, folks reach for their wallets, right, when they want to build relationships, and I'm not, disparaging fundraisers or anything like that. Certainly they're great. But, at the same time as well, we try to, at Alpine, put our clients in rooms with people who genuinely share their interests, right? So that they can, bond as quickly as possible, but as naturally as possible. Sure, it is great to, and sometimes you have to do this. You make sure that you're, putting your client in a room with, the chairman of the committee or, chairperson or ranking member of the subcommittee, just so it's on their radar. Because, sometimes their schedules are, just depending upon the time of the year, insanely busy. And so the only, time that, they may have is a rubber chicken dinner or something, right? Where you can actually, have some time to, in a more intimate setting, bend their ear on a particular issue. But, we find it works best when we're able to put folks in the same room with people who care, genuinely care about solving the issues that our clients are working on. Some of that, I think, comes from the pre-work that, we do on the lobbying side. Where we, have those relationships, we've built those relationships over time. We understand, ultimately why those members, chose the path of, elected office, and continue to, choose again and again through reelection that path to elected office. What's keeping them there in their particular state capital or in our case, national capital, and what they're trying to accomplish. And so when we can marry up that agenda to what our clients are working on and seeking to achieve, it's really a beautiful thing.
Thank you both. So shifting gears to some specific work, you both have been in the trenches with Inseparable on some pretty tough and ongoing battles. So Jason, can you talk a little bit about the health insurance reform work that you led in Michigan? And then Shayne, gear up for some Medicaid talk.
Yeah, it's been a great work with Inseparable in Michigan on health insurance reform. I mean, the interesting piece here is it's almost like my work with veterans, and who doesn't want to help veterans? Every policymaker, every elected official, they love working with veterans, right? They love to take the pictures with veterans. They love to put out a good Veterans Day post. They love to do all that stuff. But when it comes to the grind, to actually getting something done, are they going to get in the trenches with you and fight? Similar to mental health, right? Most elected officials use mental health as one of their top priority items. It's hard to work against somebody who is trying to improve the mental health system and the mental health care in our country and our state. But it's clear that it happens. And one of the biggest challenges in Michigan with this fight is the fact that we have a large health insurer that refuses to kind of get in the same sandbox and work with us instead of against us. And that's where the persistence comes in. Right? If they think they can just delay through the legislative calendar based on how big they are and how large they are and how influential they are in our capital, that's what they're going to do. They're not going to work in good faith. They're just going to delay and delay. And we have a 2-year election cycle in Michigan. So every other year, the elected officials are up for re-election. and then every 4 years, the senators are up for reelection. And so they understand the clock and they understand how to run it down. And unfortunately, that sometimes wins at the end of the day. But what we can create in Michigan, what we have started to create, is enough noise and persistence that they know we're not going away, that our coalition is growing, the constituency is growing, the problem is growing, it's not going away. So had we fought, once and lost and went away, that's what they expect. But since we're here and we're persistent, and we're continuing to fight and educate legislators, educate leadership on both sides of the aisle, it's becoming more of an awareness now that mental health is something that we have to focus on in the state of Michigan and as a country. And I think we're making that progress quickly. But in Michigan, when you have a Senate Majority Leader suing the Speaker of the House, and a governor telling the state that the two smartest people in Lansing are the Republican Speaker and herself, kind of throws the Senate off to the side, and there's some animosity. So not a lot of stuff is getting done currently in Lansing, but it doesn't change the environment of advocating and influencing the process, and that's what we're continuing to do with Inseparable in the state.
So it's always tough to think back, especially when the wounds are so fresh, with regard to what occurred with Medicaid here federally. But the way I like to frame it in my own mind, for my own mental health, is that it's game one in a longer series. And so as far as what happened on the Medicaid front, I would say early on, and throughout the process, there were a lot of voices, which is very encouraging. That came to the Capitol, that were in inboxes on folks' cell phones, with regard to cuts to Medicaid. And early on, it became very clear to us that having all of these voices, while very, very good, who was going to specifically zero in and be laser focused on the impact to mental health services, mental health care in the United States. And so while I think it would become very easy to just become another one of the many voices, speaking at the 30,000 foot level of Medicaid, we needed to become treetop flyers and take the plane down a bit, and actually zero in on the target that was Medicaid, or excuse me, was mental health, and ensure that we were speaking, that we were the voices for so many folks that felt invisible, felt ignored, that they were on the chopping block. And so that became our fight. And we also, as Jason alluded to, knew the fact that mental health is a bipartisan thing, even in such a partisan environment that we find ourselves in today. That is one of the islands of bipartisanship that still exists in the otherwise sea of partisanship in Washington, D.C. right now. And so we elected to zero in on that. And once we did, to our surprise, we noticed that members who were considered to be quote unquote off the table in this discussion, folks like South Carolina, Representative Ralph Norman, for instance, often seen as somebody who is not going to entertain meetings, with regard to taking a softer stance on governmental programs or things along those lines. But once we were able to focus in on the issue of mental health, well, then suddenly, his team was willing to talk. And so that provided us, great insights into, members like Mr. Norman, but then also, members that he was speaking with as well. And we were able to, utilize that intel to our strategic advantage, to help advance conversations, elsewhere and with leadership as well. While ultimately we weren't able to, get everything that we were looking for, and surely not nearly enough. We were able to, ultimately open the door to, some conversations to, soften the blows here and there, as much as we could. And we certainly are not going to be resting and look forward to, coming back at this thing and working on, continuing to improve or to clean up a lot of the damage that was recently done.
Thank you, Shayne. And I think we've mentioned this in this class before, but the reason we launched the Medicaid is Mental Health campaign is that Medicaid pays for 25% of mental health care and 40% of substance use care in this country. So Shayne and the team at Alpine were like, mental health really needs to have a voice in this fight. And that's why we got involved. And I couldn't agree with you more, Shayne. It is game one. I mean, there's much more to go here. Shifting gears to, beyond Inseparable, beyond those tough fights, what can you tell us about your favorite campaign or lobbying when it doesn't necessarily have to be mental health, but we just love to hear about a time that the stars aligned and the coalitions came together and you felt like you won and it was things worked. So Jason, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I want to mention one thing Shayne said, and just it was great how he said it, soften the blow. And sometimes that doesn't seem like a win, but that can be huge sometimes. When you still are in the fight and you can soften the blow, it is a big success. And it doesn't feel like it sometimes, but it does pay off at the end of the day. And when you can still manage to make it a little bit better than what it was if you weren't there. So sometimes our clients don't see it that way, but as professionals in the business, it is good to just soften the blow a little if that's what you have to do and what you have to take. But we were never giving up. So just want to touch on that. But yeah, one of my I'm actually going to talk about when I was a legislator, because this was an issue that I brought to my legislator with the veterans being the key issue, not accessing their benefits in the state. I had actually, after I got elected, a pharmacist come to my attention and say, hey, can we meet up for lunch? I have an issue I want to talk to you about. I'm not going to get into the issue too much, but you probably heard of pharmacy benefit managers, kind of that middleman, the boogeyman inside of the prescription drug industry. And if you're familiar with how it works, these PBMs are really just kind of an unregulated gorilla that takes a lot of money from the process. And it is pushing independent pharmacies out of business. And when you look at rural areas in our country, there's no Walgreens, right? There's no Rite Aids now. I don't know if Rite Aid's a national brand or just a Michigan brand, but in Michigan, Rite Aid was a big rural pharmacist or pharmacy provider. They all went out of business, most of them. And so all you have are these independent pharmacies, and you have the Walgreens and the CVSs, pretty much. And so when I was a legislator, this was my first term, it was brought to me and I said, oh, this is going to be a tough issue. I need to learn a lot about the inside and outside of how this actually works. So I began to educate myself with him and some other pharmacists. And we charted out a plan because in my mind, the pushback was going to be intense and large, and a lot of players in this process. So we started to grow a small coalition of pharmacists in districts that I knew were going to be relevant as the fight continued based on who their legislator and who their senators were. So I built a relationship with those individual pharmacists. I made sure that those pharmacists built a relationship with their legislator, not mentioning pharmacy benefit managers at all. Just come in and have a tour of the pharmacy. I want to show you what we do. We're in your community. We support your local Little League. And I did that for a couple of years. I got into leadership and I said, now is the time. Right, we're going to do this. I'm going to be the champion, and we're just going to run through the brick wall. and we're gonna put our head down, and we're gonna be successful. We grew that coalition outside of just local independent pharmacies into all other kind of providers that were impacted by these decisions that were being made by these PBMs, unilateral, without much regulation at all, and it was impacting our constituents significantly. And as Speaker, we were able to move the first PBM legislation in the state of Michigan, and it was pretty significant for the independent pharmacies as well as CVS and Walgreens and those larger pharmacies like Walmart. But at the end of the day, through the process, to the earlier point of softening the blow, that's what they did. The other side softened the blow, and we continued to fight to get as much as we possibly could finished. But the other side was fighting to soften the blow, and they got a couple wins, but so did we. And the fact is that independent pharmacies still exist in Michigan. They're still living to fight another day because of what we did. Had we not done that, I believe that my local pharmacist would have been out of business completely. He was bringing in his ledger of a quarter, and there's 500-600 scripts, and he's making like $10 profit. That's not the profit of keeping the lights on and paying the pharmacist. That's literally $10 on the medication. And so just a big issue that would have impacted a lot of Michiganians. And, luckily we're still in that fight. I'm still working with the Independent Pharmacy Association to try to continue to chip away and to ensure they can keep their lights on to serve our residents. And it isn't just, I say rural, it's not just rural though. Inside urban communities, there's deserts of pharmacies. And then, we need to encourage more pharmacies in those areas and in rural areas, not be driving them out of business. And so it was a big fight. We brought in a lot of people, but we started 3.5 years prior to even introducing anything to build that coalition and build that relationship and that process. And for myself, through that time, I was able to educate legislators to a level of awareness and to a level of understanding of the policy, so that when these players came in to say, this is going to raise drug prices, this is actually going to do the reverse of what you're asking for, they had the knowledge and the wherewithal to push back. And we provided them with reliable data to back up for their local districts with all those pharmacists that had just been, consistently meeting with them for the last 2 years. And so it was still a hard road. And again, like I said, at the end of the day, they softened the blow, but we were able to maintain a significant amount of our policy change, which was a big win for Michigan.
I'm thinking back to just as Jason, mentioned when he was a member. I'm thinking back to when I was a congressional staffer, and one of the first big issues, in healthcare that I got to work on was an issue that my boss was very passionate about. Still is very, very passionate about. And it's congenital heart defects, CHDs, or congenital heart disease. And so this was, getting to meet parents, who had children who were affected by this genetic, this congenital heart defect was incredibly powerful. And there was just a really great campaign. So you had all these, various, small, foundations, that were a family who maybe lost a baby, because of CHD, or a patient who, later in life, because they were able to, get in a clinical trial or what have you, were able to extend their lives through that, and because of that, started a foundation that was raising money, and so you had all these various foundations and organizations of from anyone from one person show to tens of folks, working there, to, even hundreds of folks working. So just incredible to get to work with all these organizations. They were all, rowing in the same direction. They wanted continued research funding at the National Institutes of Health, and wanted to do more or continue, disease surveillance, over at CDC. And we knew that we were, in for a fight. As Republicans had control of the chamber at the time, they were really focused on, not growing federal spending. And the best that we could hope for at the time was level funding. So not seeing a cut or what have you, just maintaining the level of funding. My boss, who was Republican, was like, that's not acceptable. We're going to shoot for increased funding to these programs because it's vitally important. And we leaned in on it. We used our personal relationships on Capitol Hill. He used his personal relationships within the conference. Of course, we had just great air support from our various advocacy groups on the outside, who were, flooding the zone, who were using their relationships that they had with members of Congress, in their districts, with their, federal senators, going in with their personal, stories, and making those connections. And then not just allowing, like, say, a Hill advocacy day, one day or maybe 2 days, to come and go. But we're rather, staying in touch, at the district level as well. Following the work of the member, continuing to follow up. Will you co-sponsor? Will you sign on, to this letter of funding support here, or what have you? Can you, push out this tweet, whatever it was, just to show that, that they were committed, that they were, willing to speak up and speak out when it came to this issue. All of that really came together and culminated in us being able to not only get the bill reauthorized and get the requisite funding levels that we were looking for at CDC, but we were also able to increase the funding line over at NIH as well. And so what really worked well, in summation, was the leveraging of the personal relationships. There were personal leave behinds that folks did. Kids who drew pictures and gave them to staff, to members. And these members proudly displayed them in their offices. Staff had them in their cubicles. And so as they got an email later on, they would see that letter, or they would see that postcard from that family that visited them, and it just brought back those feelings, and reminded them in certain cases of the commitment that they made to these children, to the families that maybe lost a child, that they were going to do something. And so that was huge. And then, of course, even though it was a very serious topic, these meetings were positive. They were very upbeat. And there was just this feeling of hope and resilience, and it was magnetic. It really did create a gravity around what we were trying to achieve. And again, it ultimately had the intended effect of us being able to get that done over one Congress, and not see it bleed into multiple Congresses. So that's one that really sticks out to me.
Just to touch on that, the leave behinds are never underestimate that. I think that's super important. It's a great point. It's a great story too.
Yeah, it's easy to imagine how powerful artifacts from kids would be too. Like, that's just so different from everything else that's being left behind. So thank you, Jason and Shayne, for coming today. I think we all learned so much. I have a whole page of notes over here based on what you said. So we really appreciate it. And I will kick it back to Karis.
And that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you for joining us as we work to turn mental health policy into real wins that save lives. Remember, change doesn't happen by accident. It happens when people like you make it happen.
Want to keep the momentum going? Visit inseparable.us to find toolkits, campaign resources, and ways to take action in your community. And if today's conversation resonated with you, share this episode with someone who needs to hear it, because mental health advocacy grows when we work together.
This podcast is just the beginning. If you're ready to go deeper, make sure you catch up on this entire series to get trained on how to fight and win mental health campaigns in your state. Because when we organize, we don't just make noise, we make change.
Thanks again for listening. I'm Karis Myrick.
I'm Kathleen Doughty.
And I'm Allie Larson, and we'll see you on the next episode.